Okay, students, so in this video, which I hope lasts maybe about 20 minutes or so, I'm going to give you an overview of the War of 1812, and then in a couple of subsequent videos, I'll talk about the aftermath of the War of 1812 and the Monroe Presidency, and that will pretty much cover chapter 12. So let's get into that. The first thing that I want us to notice when we deal with the War of 1812 is to kind of begin where chapter 11 will wrap up, and is to ask the question, why did we go to war with Britain as opposed to France? Because if you've been paying attention, you've noticed we've had problems with both of those countries. I think the answer to that, I'm going to go ahead and put all of this up here and I'll just talk through them, can be hit when you look at these things. Britain was capturing American ships and sailors. That's called impressment. That's a factor. They controlled British forts along the Great Lakes. That's obviously a problem, so that's a factor why we go to war with England as opposed to France. France doesn't have any forts over here. They were aiding Native Americans, particularly an Indian, a Shawnee Indian by the name of Tecumseh, who we'll talk about at the end of chapter 11, so this will mesh. There was a desire in the United States to expand territory, to pick up Canada, which was controlled by Britain at this time, and perhaps Florida, so there was a push for that. Connected with that, there was the role of the war hawks, which were Southern and Western leaders in our country, members of Congress, who wanted this war to gain more land. And it seems kind of weird. The major reasons that are often listed to this war are maritime reasons, the navigation on oceans, impressment. But actually, New England didn't like this war. So the role of the Warhawks was significant in that, wanting war with Britain, not France, because France didn't have any territory over here that we could get. And Britain, just in general, is not showing respect for the United States. So the war gets declared. It's known as Mr. Madison's War. And when we entered that war, we had problems. We were not militarily prepared for it. We had a very small navy of only about 12 ships, and Britain had an extremely powerful navy. You see the data on that. Americans did not like being drafted into the military, the U.S. military, particularly during peacetime. They preferred to enlist in state militias, very disorganized. So we don't have a very organized army at the beginning of it. Our economy's not in good shape, a lot of paper money, but not a whole lot of gold and silver, inflation in other words, and we weren't taking a whole lot of revenue in from tariffs because of these problems with Britain. So problems coming out from all over the place as we enter the war, and regional differences. New England, strangely enough, doesn't support this war. It's the South and West that do. But nonetheless, we end up going to war with Britain, and we're going to hit in this video the highlights of what happened in the War of 1812. This map just kind of gives you a brief summary so you can be reminded of the geography when we talk about some of these things. There's going to be a failed invasion by the U.S. in Canada. Britain's going to have a continual blockade along the Atlantic coast. There's going to be fighting along the Great Lakes and in upstate New York. Then the key battle in the war is going to be down at the Battle of New Orleans. So we'll talk about each of those kind of big events separately. There's another map when you pull up the PowerPoint. If you want to look at it a little bit more closely, you can. These are the events that I'm fixing to talk about in detail of what happened in the War of 1812. So I'm not going to read through that. You can scan over that, but I'm going to mention each of these in turn to you. So this is just a good summary screen of the big events that happened in the War of 1812. So let's just get into what those big events were. Like I mentioned to you just briefly a second ago, at the beginning of the war, we launched a failed three-pronged invasion of Canada. You can see the different places. We should have simply concentrated on Montreal. Instead, we divide our forces, and all three of those attacks were failures. So any attempt to gain British land in Canada came to a very quick stop at the very beginning of that war in 1812. So that's one event that takes place in the War of 1812, which is worth noting. The next thing that I want to mention to you is an American ship that earned a significant reputation in the War of 1812. It was the United States ship, the USS Constitution. In the War of 1812, early in the war, it was over toward Britain and met the HMS, that means His or Her Majesty's ship, the Guerrière, and the Constitution was hit a couple of times by some shots from the Guerrière, and those shots just seemed to bounce off the wooden hull of that ship, thus earning it the nickname of Old Ironsides. That's what the Constitution became known as. You can still go and view that ship. It's in the port of Boston, still a commissioned U.S. ship, even though obviously it's not going to fight in any battles, just kind of an honorary distinction. So that's a significant thing that came out of the War of 1812 that is worth noting. Another thing worth noting, and this is a bit of another positive that happens in the war and for the Americans, and that's fighting that takes place on Lake Erie. The key hero in that fighting, and this is in 1813, is an American commander by the name of Oliver Hazard Perry. He and his men built a fleet of ships just out of the wood around the Great Lakes area on Lake Erie, and held off and defeated a British fleet on Lake Erie. Pretty significant, kind of a long shot victory, but nonetheless he was victorious. When Oliver Hazard Perry reported back to Madison, the president, about that victory, one of these notable quotes that comes from the War of 1812 is what he included in his message that he sent back to Madison when he said, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." So, fighting on Lake Erie and the hero status that is gained by Oliver Hazard Perry. Then we need to turn to our attention to another event that kept Britain from ultimately being successful in this war. The U.S. doesn't whoop Britain, we just kind of avoided getting defeated. And one of those was fighting that took place in the area of upstate New York, kind of considered a turning point in the War of 1812. Britain wanted to capture the Hudson River, Lake Champlain, down towards New York City to divide the New England states from the rest of the states. Then you can defeat each half. But an American commandant, an American master commandant by the name of Thomas McDonough, used cleverness, disguise, and all sorts of intrigue that threw the British off, and was able to prevent this British fleet from moving south to capture, again, that Hudson River, Lake Champlain corridor, and prevented the U.S. from being split. So there you have it, the achievement there of McDonough and the Americans in upstate New York. Now kind of in some ways a negative in the War of 1812, but there's a positive story that comes out of it, is the British in 1814 landed troops on the Chesapeake Bay south of Washington, D.C., and the Americans very embarrassingly marched out to fight them, but just pretty much retreated. It was pretty bad stuff. The British swept into D.C., burned part of our capital city, including the White House and the Capitol building. So that's not good. The positive story that comes out of this, and some of y'all may have heard about this, is the First Lady, James Madison's wife. Her name was Dolly Madison. She's in the White House. Her husband has already left to go and try and help fight the British. He wasn't very good at that, by the way. But Dolly Madison in the White House, she hadn't left yet. Soldiers are trying to get her to leave. The British are coming into the city. And she just hadn't left. When she's leaving, above a staircase, she's reminded and sees this big portrait of George Washington. Didn't want the British to destroy it or defame it. So she was insistent that those soldiers bust the frame and take the picture out of it. And she won't leave until they do. And she runs out of the White House, as the story goes, kind of with that portrait tucked there with her other stuff that she's leaving with. So the fighting that took place at Washington, D.C., I've got some other slides if you kind of want to see more on that when I post the video. But moving on to another key event that happened in the War of 1812, after the British captured and defeated and burned part of D.C., they moved on, and a really more important city was Baltimore, Maryland, and the Americans knew that. The key fort guarding the port or the harbor of Baltimore was Fort McHenry. The Americans mined the fort, put explosives in the water so the British ships would be kind of blown out of the water, made it difficult for them to capture, and they never did. They never captured Fort McHenry. The key story, the key story that comes out of that is an American by the name of Francis Scott Key was being held as kind of a prisoner on a British ship. He was trying to negotiate kind of a prisoner swap, so he was on board one of these British ships and had no idea as he's watching the fighting. The British are bombing Fort McHenry, trying to get it to surrender, has no idea what's going on except for the fact that he can see throughout the night and by the dawn's early light, as the song goes, that the American flag is still flying. That inspired him to write our nation's national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. So that's where that came from. If you hadn't heard that story, now you know. There's a picture of Francis Scott Key. I don't know if he looked quite that dramatic, but there he is aboard that British ship, and then you can see the flag flying. If you go to the Smithsonian Institute, the Smithsonian Museums in Washington, D.C., that flag that flew over Fort McHenry is there where you can view it if you want to. Now then, for another and probably I would say the key battle that took place in the War of 1812 was the Battle of New Orleans. The key guy who you see pictured there on the left of the screen is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson in March of 1814 had defeated the British at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. It was actually Native Americans who were allied with the British, had won a key victory there. After that, he heard news that a British force of somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 men, you're looking at the red arrows on this, we'll deal with this blue stuff in the next chapter. He learned that a British army of somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 men were about to land at New Orleans to try to capture New Orleans and shut off American use of the Mississippi River. New Orleans was a key port at this time. So Jackson and troops of kind of frontiersmen, some Native Americans, strangely enough, who were loyal to America, and he gets the support of a pirate by the name of Lafitte, who helped stave off the British fleet from arriving earlier. He gets there. It's actually not New Orleans. If you're driving into New Orleans on I-10, it's actually at Chalmette. And he just digs in and builds entrenched position there. And in January, I think the battle was actually fought on January the 8th, the British just continued to smash charge after charge. I can't remember how many attacks into the American lines at New Orleans or Chalmette, and are defeated. So Andrew Jackson became a hero in the War of 1812. A major British army was defeated. Andrew Jackson is going to become a hero, kind of gaining respect from other countries. An interesting thing, that just gives you some data on the War of 1812. But look at that bottom thing that I just put up there. Is weird, but it has to do with news traveling slow at this time. The Battle of New Orleans was fought on January the 8th, 1815. The treaty that ended the War of 1812, called the Treaty of Ghent, had been signed a couple of weeks earlier on December 24th, 1814. But nobody knew that. So what happens is Andrew Jackson becomes a hero. News of his victory at New Orleans hits the newspaper, etc., about the same time that news of the treaty hit, and a lot of people, thus rising the status of Andrew Jackson, believe that the treaty was signed because of his victory at the Battle of New Orleans. They kind of connected the dots differently. So the Battle of New Orleans is significant for a lot of reasons, but the particular one is the rise to prominence and popularity of one Andrew Jackson, who will be a key political figure in the next couple of chapters that we deal with. I have all sorts of slides on the Battle of New Orleans. You can kind of check those out if you want to. After the war, notarizing how popular Andrew Jackson is, all sorts of patriotic pictures, kind of similar to those pictures we looked at earlier this year of George Washington. But there's Andrew Jackson on the top of those barricades and the British being driven off in one of those failed attacks that they launched. So, like I mentioned, the treaty that ended the War of 1812 was called the Treaty of Ghent, or Gent. You hear it pronounced differently. It's a city in Belgium where British and American ambassadors met. James Monroe was there. John Livingston also helped negotiate that treaty. I think Livingston was already there, and President Madison sends Monroe to help negotiate this treaty. And in that treaty, the bottom line, I'll tell you a couple of different things, but bottom line, it just led to what was known as the status quo antebellum. Just two Latin words. Status quo means the same as it was before. Antebellum means before the war. So, little was changed. I think both countries agreed to pay for any damages that may have been done, but no land has changed hands. Nobody gains or loses lands. They just say, the war's over, and that's it. That's as if nothing ever happened. But even though no territory was gained or lost, that does not mean that the War of 1812 did not have some significant results. So we'll end this video with the results of the War of 1812. And you can just see them listed here. I'll just comment on each of them briefly. As a result of the War of 1812, we gained respect from other European nations. We didn't actually defeat Britain, but we kept from being defeated by Britain. So that's significant. It killed the Federalist Party. We'll talk about that more a little bit on the next video. The Federalist Party opposed the War of 1812. The U.S. won, so it's an embarrassment to the Federalist Party. They don't survive. Temporarily, and that's the key word, there were signs after the War of 1812 that differences between the different sections of the country were going to die down, if not go away. So it temporarily broke down sectionalism, and it made heroes in the United States. Two generals, William Henry Harrison, who had won an important victory in the war, defeating Tecumseh's Confederation actually before the War of 1812, and then won some key battles. He became a hero and future president. And, of course, the key hero and future president, the number one hero, would be Andrew Jackson. It hurt the Indians. They supported the British for the most part. The British lose, so they're losing support. Their days are numbered. So that's a result of it. We don't get goods from Britain during the war, kind of like in the American Revolution, so American manufacturing increases. Our national pride and our national identity grows as a result of this war, which we'll talk about some examples of that in the next video. And we'll also see a result of this war, and we'll tie this in with the Federalist Party, is that during the war there was talk of nullification and secession in New England. That set a precedent of those doctrines that would